Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. So today what I wanted to talk about is the kind of some of the forms that are not used a lot, but are used, and some that should be used more often, and just kind of get into them because just based on some questions that I've had recently on exchanges and things like that, I wanted to make sure that you guys are familiar with the forms that are necessary to kind of go hand in hand with those things. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. Let's see what we got here. All right. So what you should be looking at is right now the buyer's intent to exchange form. So we talked about this yesterday a little bit in Boost Camp, and we've had 1031 exchange classes in the past, and this form comes up, right? So this is for if a buyer is buying a replacement property or buying a new investment and they're exchanging out of an investment property already, right? They've listed an investment property, they're selling it, and they need to find another investment property to complete a 1031 exchange. And that's what this form is for. This is that addendum that you add to your purchase agreement for the property that you're purchasing as the replacement exchange investment property. So the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated and made a part of the purchase agreement, which should be the default because we're including it. The only reason it would be something different than the purchase agreement is if we're incorporating it as part of a counteroffer or something like that. Okay, so we're going to leave it as the purchase agreement. And this dated right here is the date of the purchase agreement, right? So it should match the same date as the purchase agreement that is being drafted. The property is the property that we're purchasing. Tom Smith, John Smith right now are the buyers. The sellers would be the sellers if you had the seller's name. Buyer's intent to exchange, paragraph 1, is it is the intent of the buyer to utilize this transaction as part of an exchange of a like-kind property under Internal Revenue Code 1031 and the regulations promulgated thereunder. It's a fancy word for any of the regulations that fall underneath that code. The other property, this is the property that the buyer is selling as part of the exchange. The other property to exchange is described as whatever the property address. That's if you've already got a one listed and sold, that is the other property address, or to be designated by a buyer who shall take the steps necessary to enter into a contract to sell and transfer such other property. So if you don't have the property already in escrow, already listed, then you can check this box down here. But it's kind of crazy to be doing this exchange and starting the exchange and finding purchases without already having the property in escrow. Now, just briefly, a 1031 exchange, right? The rules for 1031 exchange are the buyer sells the property, and within 45 days of closing escrow on that property that they sold, they have 45 days to identify properties and 180 days after close to close on one of those identified properties. What we're doing here with the exchange is kind of getting the process started earlier. Instead of waiting till close of escrow on the down leg on the sold property, we're going to start the process of looking for replacement properties while we're in escrow. So this is the buyer's property that is for sale or sold. That's the address that goes here. Here's the cooperation, right? In the past, before we had this form, what we would do is just in our offers, in the other terms and conditions, we would write seller agrees to cooperate with buyer's 1031 exchange at no cost to seller. We would put that in. Now we include this form instead. Says seller agrees to cooperate in effecting buyer's exchange as specified below. Seller in this transaction shall not be required to take title to other property for any period of time as an accommodation to buyer unless agreed in writing. That's not going to happen. Seller agrees to take such actions and execute or consent to such additional documents and transactions as may be reasonably requested by buyer, provided that all other conditions of this agreement are met. So it's just saying that, hey, listen, the seller's going to sign whatever they need to sign to help with the buyer's exchange. Doesn't mean they're not going to take ownership of any of the properties, none of that stuff, just that they're going to cooperate with what is necessary with accommodators and such for the buyer to be able to complete this exchange. Okay. Paragraph 4, failure of exchange. If buyer is unable through no fault of buyer to complete the transfer of such other property by the close of escrow in the agreement or is extended by mutual agreement, right? So if I can't close the escrow on my down leg, at least by the time that we've agreed to close the escrow on this purchase or any extensions that we may have agreed to, the default is this transaction shall close escrow as a sale without extension of time of closing. So the default is, hey, I haven't closed mine, right, to do the exchange, but I'm still going to complete the purchase of this property. That's the default. Or I'm going to check a box that says the close of escrow for this transaction shall be extended by a maximum of blank days to enable buyer to complete such arrangements, right? So if I haven't been able to complete the sale of my down leg, we're already going to build in an extension for the replacement property on this exchange so that I can still complete the sale of the property I'm exchanging out of, right? I can add days, 30 days, 60 days, whatever you think may be necessary or that you want to build in to this exchange addendum. Or C, this transaction can be canceled and the buyer's deposit will return, right? So if I can't complete the sale of the property I'm exchanging out of, then the property I'm exchanging into, I'd have the right to cancel and get the deposit back. Okay. Or other, right? We can kind of negotiate any other thing, right? Like, hey, I mean, I don't even know what you would put in there. Buyer will pay a per diem for the exchange, whatever other terms, right, that you would want to build in the exchange out of the property you're selling and the exchange into the property you're purchasing. Okay. So failure of exchange. The default is I'm still going to buy the house or buy the property, whatever it is. I can check the box that we will extend the close of escrow to allow me to try to complete the sale on the down leg, right? Or the exchange property I'm changing out of, or we can cancel, right? We're just going to say, hey, look, if I can't sell that one, I'm just canceling this one, right? Or we can make some other kind of agreement on the terms of that. Any questions on paragraphs, 2, 3, 4? Any questions on those? So this form is what I'm going to use when I'm selling an investment property that I want to exchange out of, and I'm exchanging into another investment property. Okay. Indemnity. Buyer shall indemnify, defend, and hold harmless the other parties to this transaction and agents from all liabilities and any additional attorney fees, accounting fees, or any other costs arising from or connected in any way with the exchange. So all we're saying is that if for some reason I do something where maybe I'm penalized in the exchange and I have to pay taxes, I'm not going to hold the seller responsible if they're not the cause of the issue. Any additional terms that we may want to add in there for this exchange. And here's the tax and legal consequences. Locating and designating properties pursuant to this addendum, if applicable, are the responsibility of the party requesting the exchange, which is in this case the buyer, and will not occur automatically as a result of this addendum. If the exchange will be non-simultaneous, right? That means I'm not exchanging over. The exchanger, the property to be acquired by exchanger, must be identified within 45 days after transfer of exchanger's current property. In this case, the exchanger is the buyer. Excuse me. The acquisition generally must be completed within 100 days after transfer of exchanger's current property, and the 180-day period may be shorter under some circumstances. The manner of structuring an exchange transaction will have significant tax and legal consequences. Parties should consult a qualified California real estate attorney or their tax advisors or both regarding this important matter. Scope of broker's duty. The parties agree that no real estate broker agent involved in this transaction has given either party tax or legal advice regarding whether the property and other property qualify for an exchange. The parties are advised to seek the advice of a qualified California real estate attorney or certified public accountant regarding the ability and legal requirements to complete the exchange. So like I told the people that we talked about this yesterday in class, and I tell you guys all the time, is we can't give them in-depth tax advice. We can't tell them for sure exactly what's taxable. What is it? Do they qualify for exchanges? Does this property qualify for the exchange out of and into? Those things need to be handled by, like this says, an attorney or a CPA for what those tax consequences could be. Also, you can advise them to talk to an accommodator, right? An exchange company, which can also give them some advice. For us, when we're talking about this as agents, we're talking about the possibility of doing exchanges and how they can avoid deferring, or how they can avoid paying the taxes. They're not really avoiding, they're deferring paying the taxes to a later date. We can only give them the broad strokes, right? Yes, we believe this qualifies for the exchange. Yes, you shouldn't have to pay any taxes, but in order for us to give them the 100% true answer, we have to say, you need to speak to a CPA though, because I don't know all the tax laws. So CPA is going to tell you if there still may be some tax consequences, what those tax consequences may be. And then the qualifying for an exchange. Here's an exchange company, that exchange company, or you should talk to an exchange company. Here is a referral I have for a couple that I've used, but if you want to find your own, you can Google for 1031 exchanges and accommodators, but they'll be able to advise you on what the rules are for the actual exchange. Your tax liabilities will be the CPA's guidance. So we've got to make sure that we're doing that and not just doing it by conversation. We've got to follow that up with some things in writing to protect ourselves. Like, hey, we had the conversation on the phone about what you should do and who you should talk to. Now I'm going to follow that up with an email and say, per our conversation today on the phone, I advise you to speak to a CPA and an exchange company about all of the guidelines in that exchange and what tax consequences can be. Okay, so here we are with the buyer's intent to exchange. Any questions about that? Remember, I'm going to include this with any offers I have for a buyer that has sold an investment property and is looking to exchange into another investment property, a like kind property. So this intent to exchange can be used when we're doing a immediate exchange, which means I'm buying a property while I'm selling the property, and we're going to close those escrows pretty much concurrently, like if we're doing a contingent sale. And also if it turns into a deferred exchange, which means I close my escrow and then close escrow on this one, much later or after the fact, after this one's already been closed. So any questions about the buyer's intent to exchange addendum? No, you guys got it? Or you're more confused? Either one is possible. If you have any questions or something pops up, just put it in the chat and then I'll go back to it. So now on the flip side of that, we're going to do a seller's intent to exchange, right? So now I've put my property, I have an investment property that I'm putting on the market. I've sold it. I am now disclosing to the buyer that I have an intent to exchange out of this property and find a replacement exchange, another investment property that I want to exchange into to avoid at the moment, to defer my tax payment. So this is the form that I would include with any offer I received on a listing of mine that the intent was to do a 1031 exchange. So again, this is probably either going to be part of the purchase agreement, or I could make it part of my counter offer because I'm assuming that I didn't get it with any offers. So I can check off the box here and make it part of any counter offers, ignore this date. And the date here would match whatever the date was of my counter offer being drafted. I would put the information in as who the buyers were, who the sellers are. And again, just like with the buyers one, this is a disclosure to the buyer saying, hey, Seller has an intent to exchange. It is the intent of the seller to utilize this transaction as part of an exchange of like-kind property under the Internal Revenue Code 1031 and the regulations promulgated thereunder, just like the buyers, right? Whatever the rules are for the 1031 code. The other property that I'm exchanged into is described as, well, I don't have an identified property that I'm exchanging into yet in most cases. So in this case, I'm going to check this box and where it says to be located and designated by seller who shall take all the steps necessary to enter into a contract to acquire such other property. Because I don't know yet, right? As opposed to on the buyer's intent to exchange, where I've already probably sold my investment property and now I'm writing offers on property to be the replacement, right? To be the property I'm exchanging into. This one is saying to the buyers that I've sold you this property or I'm selling you this property, and I will be identifying later the properties that I want to exchange into. So I would check that box. Paragraph 3, now instead of it the seller cooperating, this is the buyer cooperating. Buyer agrees to cooperate in effecting seller's exchange as specified below. Buyer in this transaction shall not be required to take title to other property for any period of time as an accommodation to seller unless agreed in writing. Well, in this case, yeah, we are probably going to do that because I may have to close escrow on this property that we're selling before I close escrow on the property that I've identified. Buyer agrees to take actions and execute or consent to such additional documents and transactions. Just like the seller, you're going to sign and do anything that I need to as part of this exchange. We got a question in the chat that says, can exchange be made with a single family home? Yes, absolutely. Just for clarity, right? Like kind is the designation for an exchange. So let's, for example, say I have a 4-unit building that I am selling to exchange out of. My exchange could be any other property that is also technically income producing. I just can't exchange into a property that I'm going to now live in as my principal residence. So for example, I sell 4 units. I can, if the single family matches the criteria for like kind, which means it's, more than my tax basis of my previous property, the 4 units. I'm encumbered the same amount, which means whatever mortgage I held on my 4 units prior is the same amount is applied to this new property. And the cash that I would have gotten from the sale of my 4 units is all invested into the single family. So if a single family matches that, then absolutely I could do it. If a vacant lot matches that criteria, I could buy a vacant lot with it. It doesn't have to be it doesn't even have to be collecting rents. So I could buy a commercial building. I could buy a tenants in common building, right? I could invest in a TIC with it. It's just as long as it meets the criteria of that it's more than the tax basis of the property that I was exchanging out of. I'm encumbered the same amount, which means I have mortgages that are equal or greater than, and all the money that I've gotten, all the proceeds that I receive from the sale are also invested into that property. So yeah, it could be anything, single family, vacant lot, more units. It could be multiple units. It could be 3 single families. Doesn't matter. It could be multiple properties. Okay. Failure to exchange. If seller is unable to, through no fault of the seller, to locate, designate, enter into a contract to acquire or complete the acquisition of such sale of other property by the close of escrow in this agreement or as extended by mutual agreement, this transaction shall close without extension of time for closing. Meaning if I can't find a replacement property, I can't do anything and it's not my fault, then the default, just like the buyers, is we're still going to complete the sale. Or we're going to check the box and say the close of escrow for this transaction shall be extended by 30, 60, 90 days, whatever it is you feel is necessary for your seller to find a replacement property. Or C, this transaction shall be canceled, right? If I can't find a replacement property and I don't want to keep looking for a replacement property because it's difficult, whatever the case is, and I don't want to put myself in a position where I may be forced to pay taxes, then I'm going to cancel. Right? That's what we're going to do. This deal is going to cancel if I can't find a suitable replacement for me to exchange into, or any other terms that we may put into place as part of this exchange. The seller shall indemnify and hold harmless the other party to this transaction, the buyers, its agents, and liabilities from any additional attorney fees, accounting fees, or any other costs arising from or connected to any way with this exchange. Meaning, if my exchange becomes more expensive or there's things that have to be done, I'm not going to go back after the agents or the buyer. Any additional terms I would want to build into that, the tax and legal consequences. Again, it's explaining how the 1031 works, which means that if I close escrow on this one within 45 days, I've got to identify the replacement properties, and within 180 days of that close, I have to close on one of those replacement properties for the exchange. Questions about exchanges, again, in general, from the buyer side, from the seller side, or about either of these forms, the buyer's intent to exchange or the seller's intent to exchange addendum. Any questions? Now, if I'm doing an exchange, I need to incorporate this addendum into my purchase agreements. Right? If I'm a seller and I'm going to exchange into something else and I'm accepting an offer from a buyer, I've got to include this in my counter offers if it's not already included. If I am a buyer that is exchanging into, I've got to incorporate this into my purchase agreement when I'm making offers on the properties that I want to exchange into. Has to be included. No ifs, ands, or buts. Okay. So any questions? No? You guys are good. Everything's fine. And look, I know if you don't want to ask questions here, it's fine. You can always hit me up and ask me questions later. But just know that these two forms have to be included if there's exchanges happening from either side. Okay. All right. So let's move on. So this is a form that we don't use enough. We should be using more, because really what it's going to do is it's going to look, notices to perform historically, everyone assumes we're only using when we want to cancel a transaction. And that really shouldn't be the case for a notice to perform. Okay. It's really more what it is, a notice. Now, is that the first step to canceling? If I'm a buyer or a seller and I want to cancel a transaction, is a notice to perform sometimes my first step to that? Yes. Is it the only outcome when a notice to perform is used? No. And I think so, buyers and sellers have gotten to this idea. Well, not buyers and sellers, buyers agents and listing agents have gotten to this place where we're afraid of using notices to perform because we feel like the only option after the use of it is that we're going to cancel the transaction. It's not true. We also have to look at it as a paper trail that we would use to show our clients that we're working on their behalf in their best interest per the terms of the contract that we've agreed to. So, sometimes sellers are late, right? They haven't sent disclosures. They haven't sent paperwork they need to. They're not taking the steps that are necessary as far as contractual obligations and contingencies go. And even if we have no intention to cancel, we can use this form as proof that we're acting on our client's best interests. Say, for example, I'm a buyer's agent. I have a seller who has yet to send me all of the necessary disclosures. And what we normally do as a buyer's agent for our buyers is we just sit and wait. Like, well, they haven't sent it yet, but we don't want to cancel. We don't want to poke the bear, so to speak. We don't want to cause the seller's agent or the listing agent and the seller to do something that might allow them to cancel. We don't want to let them go. But as we go through the transaction, we don't really have any proof that we're doing what we're supposed to for our client, for our buyer. So if a seller is late on delivering disclosures, even if I have no intention of canceling the transaction, I should be sending a notice to seller to perform so that there is a paper trail, something signed by my buyer that says we have asked the seller to perform and they have failed to do that. So we should start embracing the idea of notices to seller to perform and notices to buyer to perform. And so we're going to go through it a little bit on how we could use notices and why we should use them. So first, buyer hereby gives seller notice that buyer has not yet received from seller the items checked below. If seller does not provide buyer with these items, buyer may be entitled to cancel the agreement or delay removing an applicable contingency. And I think that's the part that becomes most important, is that your contingency periods, right, can be affected. And it's mainly just the investigation periods and the disclosure periods. They can be affected by if the seller is late. And we want to use these notices to perform with the seller to kind of have proof that the seller was late, so that we can delay removing contingencies and not be subject to notices to perform from the seller for those things. Okay. So first, delivery of information related to leased or liened items or systems, paragraph 3N1, and then the description of that 3N1 information that should be delivered for leased or liened items is explained in 9B6. So you can always refer to what item of the 3N1 disclosure is being referenced here. Okay, so you go to 9B6, which would be leased or liened items. So there is a contingency for the buyer to accept and qualify for leased and liened items that have to be transferred with the property. Okay. And the seller has 7 days, just like everything else, to deliver all the documentation necessary for my buyer to accept the leased and liened items and qualify for them. So if I haven't in 7 days got the information that's required or related to those leased or liened items that I have to accept with the property or qualify for in order to close escrow on the property, then I need to send a notice to perform and say, hey, listen, you got to give me some more time. Right. So, for example, most sellers now are reducing the amount of time that a buyer has to review all the documentation, right, to remove their contingencies. So if I'm at day 10 and I haven't received the items from the seller, then I may not be able to remove my contingency on day 10 like the seller has requested. So I need to send this notice to perform so I can ask for an extension on my contingency period, so that I can review the documentation. And this is the only way I can start that process, because I have to first notify them that they're late and haven't given us the documentation. So I don't even know how much time I need for an extension because I haven't gotten the stuff I need to review yet. 1B, the following fully completed statutory and supplemental disclosures, the examples of which are the TDS, the NHD, the SPQ, the exempt seller's disclosure, if it's an exempt seller from providing those disclosure forms. But I have to get the TDS. I have to get the SPQ. I have to get the NHD report before I can remove my investigation period contingencies, because I have to review those things. So I have to ask for that. Okay. The fully completed lead disclosures, which is also a statutory disclosure. The fire hardening and defensible space advisory, the disclosures and addendums. We're going to talk about that format also in a moment. Any earthquake or environmental hazard booklets, right? I have to get those. If I haven't received those, I need to send a notice to perform. The condominium disclosures. Any disclosure of property insurance claims that the seller has, they're supposed to provide those to me. And if I haven't gotten them, I need to send a notice to perform. The disclosure of evidence of authority to act in a representative capacity. So this says paragraph 28 and 33. So, right, we have the representative capacity signature disclosure, or in the purchase agreement, it has a space there for if there is a representative that is signing on behalf of an entity. They have to give me, within 5 days of acceptance, they have to give me proof that they're authorized to act on behalf of that entity. So I have to ask for the notice. I have a notice of performance if they haven't provided me that. Any inspection reports that they're required to provide to me, which could be the city pre-sales, if they've agreed to give me a prior professional home inspection, any inspections, right? So the 9A reports, the certificate of compliance inspections for the city of LA, any pre-sale inspections for the cities in California, like, Compton, Maywood, Huntington Park, Linwood, the Southgate, right? Any of those cities, those reports. Any other disclosures or deliveries that we may have agreed upon. Okay. A notice to perform if they haven't removed their personal property that they left behind, the garbage. Okay. Anything else that we may want to include in there, and then next will be the contingencies. Somebody here we have in chat: is there a form we use if we sell investment property or flip and ask the seller for an itemized list of what has been removed and replaced, cost of buyers? Well, anything that isn't already there, like disclosures and deliveries, right? Forms, documents, whatever, you could put here in paragraph K. That would refer to that. Contingencies. So now we're going back to the SPRP. We're going to a separate form that is not the purchase agreement, but an SPRP, which is has been made part of the purchase agreement, removing of the finding of replacement property contingency. That's one. The removal of the close of replacement property contingency. That's another. So those are contingencies for the seller. Okay. So this is what we need to use. If the seller is late on delivering us any disclosures, reports, documents that we've agreed upon, or if they haven't removed a contingency that they're required to remove, then this is what we would use, a notice to seller to perform. Now, the default in the contract is it is 2 days. If you do not take the contractual action specified above within 2 days, or blank, no less than 2 days is specified in the agreement, unless I have countered you something else, right? So if I'm the seller and I say in my counteroffer, any notices to perform will allow the seller to have 3 days after delivery of a notice to perform to take the contractual action. If I haven't done that in the counter, I can't change it, right? You can't change it. You can't say, hey, listen, we're giving you 3 days, we're giving you 1 day, you can't change any of that. It has to be the 2 days unless I've changed it by counter. Okay. Buyer may cancel this agreement if I do that, if I send this notice to perform, notwithstanding the previous sentence, if the contractual action is for the removal of abandoned personal property that we just talked about right here, back here, which was this 2L or 1L right here, you have to give them 3 days to perform that. Okay. And this is what I would send to the seller. Questions about the notice to seller to perform. Okay. Moving on to the NBP, the notice to buyer to perform. In accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement. We're going to leave it at that, right? Because that's where all these contingencies and contractual obligations are. So we're going to leave it alone. Buyer and seller are referred to as the party. Seller hereby gives buyer notice to, as applicable, remove the specified contingency and take the specified contractual action as follows. So the left half of the form is contingencies. The right half is contractual actions. In order for you to use a notice to seller to perform or a notice to buyer to perform, there has to be already some contractual time period. Right? We know the contingencies have a default time period for the buyer. They're all 17 days, unless they've been modified by a counter or they were changed when the offer was written. All the contingencies have a time period. Okay. Contractual actions have time periods that are referenced in the contract. Anything else that I do outside of what's already written in the contract, like for example, if I say to a buyer in a counteroffer that the buyer must pre-qualify with my lender, okay, and I then don't give them a time period in which to do it, I can't send a notice to perform for them to do that because I have not given them a time period to do it. So if I'm going to put things in like buyer to be pre-qualified by seller's preferred lender, then I'm going to have to put a time period on it, which is within 3 days of acceptance, within 7 days of acceptance, prior to open of escrow, something like that. But I would rather it be an amount of days after acceptance of the offer, because then I can use a notice to perform to send to the buyer, right? So, for example, if I say the buyer must pre-qual with buyer's lender within 7 days or seller's lender within 7 days of acceptance, on day 5 after acceptance, I can send a notice to perform for them to get pre-qualified. If they don't do it, I would have the right to cancel. Okay, so if I'm adding a contractual obligation, something to the, of the kind of like I'm getting you pre-qualified with my preferred lender, then I have to put a time period with it. Okay. Also, if I've set you a request for repairs or an answer to a request for repairs, and I'm waiting for you to sign it on both sides, buyer or seller, there is no time period for that. So I cannot send you a notice to perform as part of that. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the loan contingencies. Like we have a choice here. I can check the box as a seller sending this notice to perform that says, "Hey, buyer, you have to remove all contingencies." If it's time, I can do that. Or I can break it down to specific ones. If the buyer hasn't removed these contingencies, I can choose loan, say, "Hey, listen, you haven't removed your loan yet. It's time. Here, I'm sending you a notice to perform for a loan contingency." Okay. And break appraisal, buyer investigations, the review of the documents. I can break them down one by one, or I can just say, "Hey, listen, it's time, remove all." Okay. And that's subject to the seller has provided everything to the buyer, like we talked about in those notice the seller to perform, as the seller has given all the disclosures, all the documents that are required, any inspection reports, anything that the seller is subject to, right? Termite, any of those things. I've provided all of those to you in a timely manner. You've had time to review them. It is now time for you to remove your contingencies. I am sending you this notice to perform. Now, I see all the time, both from agents here and from outside agents, that you guys are just sending contingency removals and emails requesting, right? You send a contingency removal form and an email and say, "Hey, listen, your contingencies are up. I sent you a contingency removal. Please sign." That process, that time that you spent doing that is meaningless without a notice to perform. Okay. So I got to check off what I'm asking for and send it. On the contractual options, the very first notice to perform I can send is the initial deposit. If they haven't deposited their funds for the initial deposit in the time that's specified, which is the 3 business days, or if you've changed it in a counter, if they don't do it, I can't just cancel. I have to first send a notice to buyer to perform. I need you guys to know that, because I have conversations with buyers agents or with listing agents all the time saying they haven't put their deposit and I'm sending cancellation. You can't do that. You got to send the notice to perform first. Okay. The delivery of an increased deposit, if there is one, any liquidated damages clause that would go along with any funds that were deposited, updated lender information, right? So it's in paragraph 5C if they have a certain amount of time if they've changed lenders. The notice of any FHA or VA requirements, their verification of funds, which is, the default is immediately. So if you may have changed it, that would be, necessary for this. So you can see all of these things: the verification of funds, the loan application, the statutory disclosures when they have to be returned. Any of the things that are required to be signed and returned, they're here. We can check for those. We can check those boxes off and send them. So keep in mind that there are things that the buyer is required to return to you in a specific amount of time. Okay. And if they're not doing that, then I can send that notice to buyer to perform. And here in all of these items, right, as you go through this contractual action section, it tells you what paragraph is referencing the time period. So you can look at those and say, okay, hey, have they done this thing in the time period that's referenced in the paragraphs? No, they haven't. I'm going to send them a notice to perform. Okay. Note, paragraph numbers refer to the California Residential Purchase Agreement. Applicable paragraph numbers for each contingent or contractual action in other CAR contracts may be different, and they are. So if you're doing notices to perform for the RIPA, right, which is the Residential Income Purchase Agreement, those paragraphs are going to be different. They're not going to be the same one. So you got to read through the paragraphs and look where the time periods really fall, which paragraphs they fall in. If buyer does not remove the specified contingencies on the form CR, the contingency removal, or in the RR, the request for repairs, you could do that too, and take the specified contractual actions indicated above within 2 or no less than 2 days as specified in the agreement, days after delivery of this notice to buyer to perform, seller may cancel this agreement. Doesn't mean they have to, but they may. Okay. Questions about either the notice to perform, the notice to buyer to perform, or the notice to seller to perform, either NBP or NSP. Those are the abbreviations for those forms. See, notice to buyer to perform, NBP, notice to seller to perform, NSP. I hear somebody unmuted. Yes, Sylvia.
Yeah, I have a question. So when would be the best time, just to get clarification? So if you have a 17-day period on, let's say, the inspection, when would be the best time to send the notice to perform? Would it be after the 17th day or before?
No, I would suggest that you guys send it before. You can send it 2 days prior. So if I get to day 15 and the buyer hasn't removed their contingencies yet and day 17 is coming, I can, if I want to expedite the process, I can send that notice to perform 2 days prior to the contingency period or the contractual obligation.
Okay,
right?
Great.
So I can send it 2 days prior. You don't have to, but you can. If you wait till after, you're just extending the contingency.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions, guys? Anybody else? Okay. And so this is a new one. There was one prior to this that came out in December of 2021, or there was this one, and then there was one that came out in December. December of 2020. Then in May of 2021, this one came out replacing it. This is for properties that are in high fire hazard zones, right? High or very high fire hazard severity zones. It has to be included if your property falls into that category. And the only way to know really for anybody is if you look at your NHD report. If the NHD report says that the property is in a high or very high fire zone, then you have to include this disclosure. Okay, it's a disclosure and advisory. So let's take a look at it. Okay, paragraph 1, fire hardening and defensible space advisory. Law applicability. 1, fire hardening disclosure. The disclosure specified in paragraph 3 are only required for sellers of residential properties that contain 1 to 4 units that are constructed before January 1st, 2010, which is going to be the majority of the houses we sell. And if the seller is required to complete a real estate transfer disclosure statement. So if it is an REO, a probate, a trust with a successor trustee selling it, and there is no required TDS, you don't have to do this disclosure. Okay. And that are located in either a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. Number 2, so 1A2. Defensible space compliance. The disclosures and requirements specified in paragraph 4 are only required for sellers of residential properties that contain 1 to 4 units. And if the seller is required to complete a real estate transfer disclosure statement and that are located in an either high or very high fire hazard severity zone. Again, you'll find that out in your NHD report. Number 3, inspection report, including fire hardening defensible space compliance. The disclosure of a final inspection report obtained under the specifications in paragraph 5 is only required for sellers of residential properties improved with 1 to 4 units if the seller is obligated to complete a real estate transfer disclosure statement. Any seller may be required to provide a copy of such a final inspection report pursuant to a contractual or voluntary disclosure as a material fact. So these are the requirements of these disclosures, and we're going to get into some disclosures and things they have to do in the forthcoming paragraphs. This is just the explanation. So built before 2010, you have to do a TDS. It's 1 to 4 units. Those are the requirements for this disclosure, and it's a high fire zone. Okay. If the buyer changes loan and terms from fixed to any other terms, does the buyer agent have to request from the seller change the terms of closing? Yeah, it's a little off topic where we are, but yes, you cannot change the terms of your financing without getting the approval of the seller. Okay. So let's try to stay on the stuff that we're on because it takes me off and then we don't finish. Okay. All right. So that's the requirements. Where to locate the information. Seller has the obligation to determine if compliance with the fire hardening and defensible space requirements are applicable to seller and the property. It may be possible to determine if a property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone by consulting with a natural hazard zone disclosure company or reviewing a company's report. This information may also be available through a local agency where this information should have been filed, right? So we're all getting NHD reports, right? We all have to do that. So in the NHD report, that's going to show up. If you don't have if it doesn't show up there, you can consult with the city. I'm sure the city would be able to tell if you're in a high, very, or high or very high fire severity zone. Okay, so NHD reports where you're going to go. Letter C, even if the property is not in either of the zones specified above, or if the seller is unable to determine whether the property is in either of the zones, if the property is in or near a mountainous area, forest-covered lands, brush-covered lands, grass-covered lands, or land that is covered with flammable material, a seller may choose to make the disclosure below because a buyer might consider the information material. A seller may voluntarily make the disclosures in paragraphs 3B and 4, even if not mandatory. So your seller can still include this disclosure if they want to, even if they don't know. Like they could say, well, I don't know, but I live in the mountains. I'm surrounded by trees. I'm surrounded by bushes. Maybe there is a high fire zone. I don't know. I can make the disclosure. It's not required. They could, but they don't have to. Okay. So here we go. 2, fire severity zone. A, the home is the home is in a high or very high fire severity zone. Like we know it is. We got that from the disclosures on the NHD report, so we're leaving it by default. Or if you have one of those sellers that, like they said, they can do it even if they're not required to, you would check the box here. The home is not in a high or very high fire severity zone. Sellers providing this form as an advisory, and if paragraph 3B is completed below, as a voluntary disclosure. That's right. So we're doing it voluntarily because we don't know, and we just want to make sure we're covering our bases. Okay. Paragraph 3, fire hardening disclosure only required to be completed if criteria in 1A1 are all met. 1A1 back here. The disclosure specified in paragraph 3 are only required, right? So that's 1 to 4 units built before 2010. NHD report says you're in a high fire severity zone and you had to do a TDS, right? So here we go. We're making our disclosure. Fire hardening statutory notice. This home is located in a very high fire hazard severity zone, and this home was built before the implementation of the wildfire urban interface building codes, which help to fire harden a home. To better protect your home from wildfire, you might need to consider improvements. Information on fire hardening, including current building standards and information on minimum annual vegetation management standards to protect homes from wildfires, can be obtained on the internet. Visit website http://www.readyforwildfire.org. Again, this is an advisory and a disclosure. This is not stuff that's making your seller do things. You just have to fill out this disclosure. B, fire hardening vulnerabilities. Seller is aware of the following features that may make the home vulnerable to wildfire and flying embers. Check all that apply. Do we know? Like, remember, this is a disclosure like other disclosures. The question is the seller aware? So is your seller aware that there's a problem with the eave, soffit, and roof ventilation where the vents have openings in excess of 1/8 of an inch or are not flame and ember resistant? If your seller's not aware of those things, don't check the box. Is your seller aware that the roof coverings are made of untreated wood shingles or shakes? Is your seller aware of that? If they are, check the box. If they're not, don't check it. Combustible landscaping or other materials within 5 feet of the home and under the footprint of any attached deck. Do you know that you have that? If you don't check the box. Single pane or non-tempered glass windows. Do you know? If you do, check the box. If you don't check it. Loose or missing bird stopping or roof flashing. If you know, check the box. If you don't check it. Do you see a pattern? And number 6, rain gutters without metal or non-combustible gutter covers. Does it have it? Do you know it doesn't have it? Check the box. If you don't know, don't check the box. Okay? Any questions up to that point? No? You guys are pretty clear on it? Number 4, defensible space requirements. Only required to be completed if criteria in 1A2 are met. We already talked about what those criteria are. Public Resource Code 4291 requires that in order to minimize the risk of fire affecting a building or structure on the property, a defensible space around the improvements be maintained within 100 feet of the improvement. Many local governments have enacted a local vegetation management ordinance or for that same purpose, collective defensible space laws. Effective July 1st, 2021, Civil Code 1102 requires disclosures regarding compliance with defensible space for certain specified properties. That's what this is. Defensible space compliance applies unless 2, 3, or 4 are checked. No local ordinance. Buyers shall obtain documentation of compliance with state defensible law. There is no local ordinance requiring proof of compliance with defensible space laws. Buyers shall obtain documentation of compliance within 1 year. This requirement only applies if there is a state or local agency or other government entity or qualified nonprofit entity in the jurisdiction where the property is located that is authorized to inspect or property or provide documentation of compliance. Authorized inspector. We don't know. That's the default, but I have no idea. You could check if they are. It doesn't require the seller to do anything. Again, this is just a disclosure. Or 2, no local ordinance. Seller within the previous 6 months has already obtained documentation of compliance. If you've got it, great, right? Talking about we're in compliance with this defensible space compliance. If you have it, if you've already gotten it, if the city say has come out or some other agency has come out and said, hey, we need to make sure we've cleared this, and you've done it and you've gotten that documentation that says it's done, then great, check the box. If not, leave it to the default. Okay. Or number 3, local vegetation management or other defensible space ordinance is in effect, which permits compliance after close of escrow. Buyer shall obtain, right? So if you know that there is an ordinance already for vegetation management or defensible space ordinance, and it hasn't been taken care of yet, you could check this box and it becomes the responsibility of the buyer to do that. Okay. If there is that and the seller has already done it, then you're going to check off box 4, which is the seller has the documentation that they've taken care of it, and here it is. Okay. If 2 or 4 is checked, the local agency from which a copy of the documentation may be obtained is blank, right? So if you know who it is, but you haven't done it, or you have done it, you give them the name of the agency. And then if this is checked here, then the people require that there's a final inspection report, whatever this agency is. If you don't know what that agency is, don't check the box. Don't add those agencies in. So remember, there's just an advisory and a disclosure. It doesn't require the seller to do anything. Now, once I make this disclosure about those things, like there is a local ordinance that says we have to clear, brush and things like that, could the buyer ask for those things to be done for the seller? Yes. Does the seller have an obligation to do them? No. Just like any other request for repair, just like any other disclosure, there is no requirement, no obligation for the seller to make repairs based on those. They're just required to make the disclosure. So don't be afraid of this. Just know if I have a home that shows up on my NHD report that says you're in a high or very high fire zone, you've got to include this with it. But don't be afraid of it. It doesn't mean the seller has to do anything. They just have to make this disclosure. Okay. So those are the ones I wanted to talk to you about today because they've come up a couple times. Do you guys have any questions about anything that we talked about today? Anything at all? No, you guys you're clear on it. I know you're going to come see me later. You're going to send me emails. You're going to call me. You're going to ask me questions. You're going to show up at my desk. I'm okay with that. But again, I want to introduce these to you because, like I said, the fire hardening one is coming up more and more and more and more. And I think there's a real lack of understanding from agents and confusion and fear because they think it means something that their seller's going to have to take some kind of action, and they don't. And the notices to perform, I just wanted to kind of take away some of that fear that you guys have from them. Again, they don't require you to cancel just because you use them, but it's a great way for you to show both as a listing agent and a buyer's agent that I'm trying to make this transaction move in a timely fashion, and I'm doing what's best for my client by giving these notices to either the listing agent or to the buyer's agent and using them properly. Okay. And then those intent to exchange forms, they're going to have to be required. You're going to have to start using them on all these exchanges. And I hear a lot more about exchanges, especially now in this market where, people are getting as high prices as they can and, want to take advantage of that equity that they've built in their investments. So I appreciate it, guys. Thank you for being here and listening to me. I know it's not a super exciting topic, so I always appreciate when I get you guys on. If you missed any part of this while you're on, remember later today, hopefully it will be on YouTube, if not tomorrow for sure. And if you need anything, please let me know. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Take care of yourselves.